The baby's cry was a death sentence. It wasn't a loud cry, not anymore. His little voice had gone hoarse 2 nights ago, turning his wails into a dry, rasping sound like sandpaper on old wood. But even so, it carried. It sliced through the dead still air of the winter forest, echoing down the slope like a tiny, desperate beacon. And Evelyn knew what that beacon could attract. It could bring wolves, or worse, it could bring him. She clutched the infant tighter to her chest, the fabric of her worn dress stiff with ice. A soft shh escaped her cracked lips as she crouched lower behind a snow-heavy log. With a trembling hand, she motioned for her other 3 sons to get down, to press their small bodies into the frozen earth and disappear. Ben, the eldest at barely 6, obeyed instantly. He was old enough to understand the shape of their fear. His cheeks were raw and red from the wind, his small fingers buried deep in the dirty folds of his mother's skirt, holding on like she was the only anchor in a world that had come loose. Daniel and Luke, twins of 4, followed a moment later. They were too exhausted to resist, their movements slow and clumsy. They collapsed into the snow beside her, their faces pale, their eyes wide and empty. They had seen too much. They had run too far. The forest around them was a cruel, silent place. No birds sang, no wind whispered through the pines. There was only the oppressive weight of the quiet and the sound of her baby's dying sobs. It was a sound that told the world they were here. They were weak. They were prey. Evelyn had no real plan. She had made it this far on pure, raw instinct and the ghost of a prayer. For 3 days and 3 nights, she had stumbled through the biting cold and the suffocating dark, with 4 children in tow and a back still striped with the fresh purple bruises of her last mistake. And mistakes were something her husband, Frank, never forgave. The slope behind them wasn't steep, but it was high. She had forced the boys up it the night before, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs after she'd heard men's voices echoing up from the ravine below. They hadn't called her name, not yet, but one of them had laughed. It was Frank's laugh, a sound like grinding stone. The moment she heard it, her blood had turned to ice in her veins. But she couldn't afford fear, not anymore. Fear was a luxury that wasted time, that dulled her reflexes. She hadn't slept for more than a few minutes at a time in days, yet her eyes scanned the woods relentlessly, like a hunted doe, her heart hammering with every snap of a twig, every shift of a shadow. Then she heard it. A crack. A heavy branch breaking under a heavy foot. It wasn't her. It wasn't the children. It was something else. Something closer than it should have been. She froze, holding her breath until her lungs burned. The baby whimpered again, a pathetic little gasp for air, and a monstrous thought sliced through her mind. The thought of tossing him down the slope, of letting him roll into the dense trees where the sound might be muffled, where he might be hidden. She would never do it. She knew she wouldn't. But the thought alone stabbed through her like a shard of glass, a sin she would carry forever. And then she saw him. At first, she only saw his boots. They were massive things, made of thick, dark leather and caked with ice and frozen mud. Then she saw legs, muscled like a bear's, wrapped in dark wool trousers dusted with snow. He stepped out from behind a thicket of pines with the slow, deliberate caution of a man accustomed to dangerous things. The axe strapped to his back glinted once in the pale, weak morning light. A scream built in Evelyn's throat, but she swallowed it down, choking on her own terror. She curled her body around her sons, trying to press them into the very dirt, to make them invisible. Her heart was a wild, frantic bird beating against the cage of her ribs, about to break free. But the man didn't move any closer. He didn't draw the axe. He didn't speak. He just stood there, about 20 yards away, watching them. His eyes were a strange color, not blue, but a pale, silvery gray, like the winter sky just before a storm. His beard was full and streaked with the frost of the mountain, and his hands, large and calloused, hung loose at his sides. He looked as if he had just stepped out of the woods and was trying to understand the sad, desperate scene he had stumbled upon. She could have run. Maybe she should have. But her legs were frozen, not from the cold, but from a terror so profound it felt like paralysis. Instead, she rose slowly, shaking. She didn't mean to, but her body moved on its own. The baby let out another weak, raspy wail, and the man's eyes softened. It was just a flicker, a tiny, almost imperceptible change in his hard face, but she saw it. And then, without a single word, he turned. He simply turned and began walking back the way he had come. He didn't walk fast, not like a man who feared being followed. He walked with the quiet, steady certainty of a man who expected to be. Evelyn hesitated. Her mind was screaming at her to run in the opposite direction, to take her chances in the wild. But her gut, the same instinct that had kept her and her children alive this long, told her something different. She had seen no cruelty in his face. She had seen only a strange, deep sorrow. And right now, sorrow felt safer than anything she had known in years. She hoisted the baby higher onto her hip, gathered her other 3 sons to her skirts with a gesture, and followed him. She didn't know why. She only knew that he was walking away from the direction of Frank's laugh. The silent man led them up through the trees, where the land grew steeper and the air grew thinner. He moved with an easy, powerful grace, never looking back to see if they were following. He didn't need to. He knew they were. Where else could they go? The path he took was barely a path at all, just a winding trail through the dense pines that only someone who knew the mountain intimately could navigate. Finally, the trees opened into a small, secluded hollow, tucked beneath a massive outcropping of dark gray stone. And there, nestled against the rock face, sat a cabin. It was a solid, square thing, built of thick, dark logs, with a stone chimney that had a thin curl of white smoke rising from it into the cold air. The sight of it, the promise of warmth, of shelter, almost made Evelyn weep. She had forgotten what a roof looked like. The man walked to the cabin door, pushed it open, and then simply stood there, holding it for them. He still hadn't spoken a single word. He just waited. Evelyn hesitated for only a second before she shuffled past him and stepped inside. The warmth hit her like a physical blow. It was a dry, heavy heat, thick with the scent of burning pine and wood ash. The sudden change from the biting cold made her dizzy. She sank to her knees just inside the doorway, not even bothering to pull the children further in. Her boys, seeing her collapse, simply crumpled into a heap around her, their small bodies finally giving in to their exhaustion. The baby, lulled by the sudden warmth, had finally fallen silent. He was asleep against her shoulder. The man crossed the small, single room and used a poker to stoke the fire in the hearth. The flames leapt up, casting dancing shadows on the rough-hewn wooden walls. He was still wordless. Still, a complete mystery. She watched him, her mind a swirl of fear and a desperate, starving hope. What did he want? Why was he helping them? She had to know. "Why?" she whispered, her voice cracking from disuse. He looked up at her then, his gaze long and unreadable. For a moment, she thought he would finally speak, would explain this strange act of kindness. But he just turned back to the fire. He added another log, watching the sparks fly up the chimney. Then, in a low, gravelly voice, he finally spoke. "I don't let wolves feed on what they didn't kill." It was the only thing he said to her all day. It was enough. Later she learned his name from the letters carved into the thick wooden beam that served as a mantelpiece above the hearth. Samuel Vaughn. The carving was deep and sure, done by a steady hand. That night, he laid out thick animal pelts on the floor for her and the boys, creating soft, warm beds near the fire. He set a steaming bowl of stew beside her, filled with chunks of meat and root vegetables. It was the first hot meal she'd had in what felt like a lifetime. As she ate, she felt something she hadn't felt in years. Safe. Not forever safe, but safe for a while. By the third day, her voice had fully returned. It was strong enough to say her own name out loud, strong enough to tell him about the bruises that still ached on her back, strong enough to explain the running, the fear, and the fact that she had no home to return to, only enemies who were hunting her. Samuel just listened, nodding slowly. He didn't ask for details. He didn't pry into the dark corners of her life with Frank. But that afternoon, she noticed he started stacking firewood higher along the cabin's outer walls, creating another barrier against the world. He went out and laid 3 more traps in the woods, deeper in the trees than his old ones. When he came back from the forest that evening, his face ruddy from the cold, he walked over to Ben. He held out his large, calloused hand, and in his palm was a small, intricately carved wooden bear. It was the size of the boy's fist, its details perfect. Ben, who hadn't spoken more than a few words since they'd arrived, blinked up at the huge, silent man in wonder. He slowly reached out and took the toy, his small fingers tracing the shape of it. A tiny, fragile smile touched his lips. That night, as Evelyn watched the heavy snow fall outside the cabin's single window, she knew this couldn't last. This small pocket of peace was temporary. Frank was still out there. "We can't stay forever," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "No," Samuel agreed from his seat by the fire. "But you can stay long enough." She almost cried at that. Long enough. What did that even mean? Long enough to heal? Long enough to be found? A week passed, and then another. A strange, quiet rhythm established itself within the 4 walls of the cabin. The boys, slowly but surely, began to heal. Their laughter, which she had thought was lost forever, started to return in small, bright bursts. Samuel showed Daniel and Luke how to stack kindling into neat, interlocking piles. He let Evelyn sleep through an entire night for the first time since the escape. She woke up with a gasp, guilt churning in her belly, and the phantom feeling of dried tears on her cheeks. How could she rest when Frank was still out there? She knew him. He wouldn't have stopped looking. He was a man made of pride and rage, and she had wounded both. She could feel his presence in her bones, a cold dread that lingered like the memory of his fists. And sure enough, the dogs came just after dawn, exactly 2 weeks from the day she had run. Samuel heard them first. His head snapped up from the piece of wood he was carving. He stood, his body suddenly tense and alert. In one fluid motion, he took down the heavy rifle that rested above the mantel. Then he strode over to the large, rough-hewn bed against the far wall, bent down, and pulled open a hidden trap door in the floorboards beneath it. "In," he said. It wasn't a request. "No," Evelyn started to say. She wanted to help, to fight, to do something other than hide. But he didn't let her finish. "In," he repeated, and this time his voice was iron. There was no room for argument. She quickly gathered the boys, her heart hammering against her ribs once more. She herded them toward the dark opening, urging them down a short, steep ladder into the small, hidden cellar below. It was dark and smelled of damp earth and cedar. Old quilts and sacks of dried goods were stored down here. When the trap door closed above them, plunging them into near total darkness, she heard the heavy latch slide into place. Then she heard Samuel's footsteps cross the floor above. Then silence. A moment later she heard the crunch of boots in the snow outside. More than one set. A heavy fist pounded on the cabin door, making the whole structure shudder. "I'm looking for a woman," said a voice she knew far too well. It was Frank, cold, angry, and close. "And 4 brats. They came through this way." There was a pause. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating. Evelyn held her breath, pressing her hand over Micah's mouth. Then she heard Samuel's voice, low, slow, and steady as a river. "Ain't no woman here, just me, and you've scared off every elk within 10 miles with that racket." Frank's voice came back, colder now, laced with menace. "Don't you lie to me, old man." "I don't lie," Samuel said simply. Then came the sound of someone trying the door handle, rattling it violently. It was immediately followed by the sharp, metallic click of Samuel's rifle being cocked. The sound was loud and final in the quiet air. There were no more footsteps after that. Just another long, tense pause. Then Frank spoke again, his voice tight with fury. "You're going to wish you didn't stand in my way." "I don't stand in the way of things," Samuel replied, his voice calm but hard as granite. "I build things, but I will burn this whole place to the ground before I let a coward like you step through my door." There was no reply. A few moments later, Evelyn heard the sound of hoofbeats, fading away into the forest. She couldn't breathe until she heard the latch on the trap door slide back and saw the square of light appear above them. Samuel didn't speak. He just reached his hand down into the darkness. She took it. By the end of that week, Evelyn knew she wasn't going to leave. Not unless Samuel asked her to. Not unless he forced her out into the cold again. And she knew, with a certainty that settled deep in her soul, that he never would. So when he came to her one evening, as the boys slept soundly by the fire, and handed her a small, simple ring he had carved from a piece of white pine, she could only look up at him in disbelief. "You don't even know me," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. He looked down at her, his pale silver eyes holding a depth she was only just beginning to understand. "I know you love your sons," he said, "and I know you keep going even when most people would fall down. Is that not enough?" She shook her head, a single tear tracing a path down her cheek. "It's everything," she said. He nodded once, a small, certain gesture. "It's everything," he agreed. And when she married him a few days later, standing beneath the same snow-heavy pines where he had first found them, she didn't wear a white dress. She wore the same patched and faded dress she had run away in. But the way Samuel looked at her, you would have thought she was a queen. The vows were spoken in whispers, carried away by the winter wind. The rings, both carved from wood, were traded with shaking hands. And Samuel, true to his nature, didn't say much. But just after they had declared themselves husband and wife to the silent forest, he leaned in and said one sentence that changed her world. "You're home now, Evelyn." And for the first time in her life, she believed it. But she also knew that Frank was not the kind of man to be denied twice. Their new home was safe for now, but the wolf was still circling in the darkness, and he was hungry. Samuel's silence had never felt empty. It was a kind of stillness Evelyn had grown to trust, like the solid trunk of an old-growth tree that doesn't creak in the wind. In the years she'd spent with Frank, every sentence had been a weapon, a threat disguised as a question. With Samuel, his wordlessness was a gift, a space where she could finally breathe. But silence, she was learning, didn't stop danger from circling. It just meant you had to listen harder for the sound of its approach. Their marriage began without ceremony, just a simple acknowledgement between two people and the silent, watching forest. There were no guests, no preacher, no celebration. Just the wind, the fire, and the comforting weight of the ring carved from white pine. It didn't fit perfectly. It scraped against her knuckle, a constant rough reminder of its newness. But Evelyn never once took it off. Her sons, in the way of children, adjusted to their new reality with a speed that amazed her. Ben started trailing Samuel wherever he went, mimicking the big man's long, lumbering stride in the snow and his quiet, methodical habits. Daniel and Luke discovered a wild glee in stacking firewood, turning the chore into a loud, chaotic game. And even the baby, Micah, had finally started sleeping through the night, his cries replaced by soft, happy gurgles. The cabin had become their world, its quiet rhythm, their safety. Evelyn, however, never fully let her guard down. Not for a single moment. She found herself constantly watching the tree line, her eyes scanning the shadows for any sign of movement. She knew Frank. He wasn't a man who let things go. His pride was a venomous living thing, and she had wounded it deeply. And she knew he wasn't alone. The men he rode with weren't just hired hands. They were his friends, a pack of bitter, cruel drifters held together by a shared love of violence. They were men who believed that hurting something gave them ownership of it. She had seen their eyes, their cold smiles, the way they played with pain like it was a game. They would be back. Samuel knew it too. He never said it, but she could see it in his actions. He began reinforcing the cabin door, adding thick new wooden slats. He layered extra boards beneath the windows. He started stockpiling more firewood than they could possibly need for the rest of the winter, creating a veritable fortress wall around their small home. He built new, more vicious-looking traps and set them deeper in the woods, along all the hidden paths leading to their hollow. He never explained why. He didn't have to. The unspoken understanding between them was stronger than any words. One morning, Evelyn woke with a start, her heart leaping into her throat. The twins' sleeping furs were empty. Before a scream could escape her lips, she heard a sound from behind the cabin, the faint, unmistakable sound of laughter. She rushed outside, barefoot in the freezing snow, her panic a cold fist in her chest. She found Daniel and Luke sitting on a felled log, giggling uncontrollably. Samuel was sitting with them, a large knife in his hand, carving crude little horses from pieces of pine bark. As he finished each one, he handed it over to the boys without a word. Evelyn knelt beside them, her chest still heaving with residual fear. Samuel finally looked up at her, and his eyes said what his mouth never would. I would never let them come to harm. She nodded, a wave of relief so powerful it almost buckled her knees. She understood. But that didn't stop the cold dread from seeping in at the edges of her newfound peace. It was the tracks that finally set everything into motion again. 2 weeks after their quiet wedding, Samuel returned from checking his traps with a new tightness in his jaw, a hardness in his eyes she hadn't seen since the day Frank had come to the door. He didn't speak. He simply came inside, removed his snow-caked boots, set his rifle by the wall, and stood looking out the back window for a long, long time. The silence in the cabin grew heavy, charged with unspoken fear. She waited. She didn't press him, didn't push. She had learned that his silence held more information than most men's shouting. Finally he spoke, his voice low and grim. They're close. He didn't need to say who they were. Tracks? She asked, her own voice a thin whisper. He nodded once. 4 horses. No packs. They're riding light. Evelyn's stomach twisted into a knot. Riding light meant they weren't just passing through. They were hunting. It could be scouts, Samuel said, though they both knew it was more than that. Frank was looking for them. Not aimlessly wandering the mountains, but actively, systematically searching. He was here. Now. That night, she gathered the boys in closer, holding them tighter than usual as the fire crackled and popped in the hearth. Samuel sat by the fire, sharpening his axe. The rhythmic shing, shing, shing of the whetstone against the steel was a steady, methodical sound, like a song with no music, a prayer with no words. Later, when the children were sound asleep and the wind pressed hard against the cabin walls, making the logs groan, Evelyn whispered into the darkness, "You don't have to do this. You don't have to keep us." Samuel didn't look at her, his focus entirely on the glinting edge of the axe. "I do." "You didn't ask for this," she pressed on, a desperate guilt welling up inside her. "I came here half dead, with 4 mouths to feed and a past full of blood." He finally set the axe down and turned to her. His face, illuminated by the firelight, was a mask of grim determination. "Evelyn," he said, his voice soft but unyielding, "you walked into my life with the only things in this world worth protecting." He rose from his stool and crossed the small space between them, and then, for the first time since she had met him, he placed a hand on her face. It wasn't a grab, it wasn't a pull, it was an anchor. "I know who I am," he said, his thumb gently stroking her cheek. "I know why I'm here." She leaned into the warmth of his hand and closed her eyes, letting his strength seep into her. For the first time in years, she allowed someone else to bear the weight of her fear, even if just for a moment. They made a new plan that night. The cabin, they knew, wouldn't hold forever, not if Frank came back with fire or with enough men and bullets. So Samuel began to build something else, He started cutting a new trail, a hidden path through the densest part of the forest, so cleverly concealed it was nearly invisible even if you were standing right on it. It wound through thickets of thorny bushes and over icy streams until it led to the mouth of a small, dark cave tucked away beneath a rocky bluff. It was their secret, their last resort. Together, they stocked the cave. They hauled barrels of water, sacks of salted meat, blankets, extra boots, and another rifle. Evelyn helped, carrying what she could while balancing Micah on her hip, her other hand guiding the older boys over roots and through snowbanks. She taught them how to walk silently, how to listen to the sounds of the forest, and most importantly, how to obey without question. When Samuel said go, they had to go. He was preparing for war. It broke her heart to see it, to see this quiet, gentle man sharpening his tools into weapons. But she knew better than to wish for peace in a world that so often punished the gentle. Then, the arrow came. It happened just after dusk. There was a sudden thwack and a whistling sound. An arrow shot clean through the window frame, embedding itself in the wall right beside the fireplace. Tied to its shaft was a small, rolled-up piece of paper. Samuel pulled it free from the wall, his movements calm and deliberate. He unrolled the paper and read it in the flickering firelight, his face unreadable. Evelyn stood as still as a statue, her heart frozen in her chest. "What does it say?" she whispered. His jaw clenched, the muscle jumping under his skin. He didn't hand her the note. He just quoted it, his voice flat and dead. "I want what's mine. If she ain't at the old crossroads by sundown tomorrow, I'll start taking what's yours, piece by piece." Her breath left her in a sudden, painful rush. He was threatening the boys. He was threatening Samuel. "You can't go," Samuel said immediately, his voice a low growl. "He'll kill you, or worse." She stared at him, her mind racing. "And if I don't go, he'll come here. He'll burn us out." "I'll be ready for him," Samuel said. He said it like a promise, like a sacred vow. But promises couldn't stop bullets. Promises couldn't stop fire. And promises couldn't stop the kind of evil men that Frank Wade ran with. They sat in silence for the rest of the night, the children blessedly unaware of the storm that was circling just beyond the tree line, played quietly near the hearth. When the boys had finally fallen asleep, Evelyn reached across the small space and took Samuel's hand in hers. "I can't let you die for me," she whispered, her voice breaking. "You're not asking me to," he said, and she knew he meant it. But Evelyn was not the kind of woman who let someone else fight her demons. She had run from Frank once. She would not let another person pay the price for her freedom. She left before dawn. She didn't take much, just her coat, her worn boots, and the sharp skinning knife Samuel had given her, tucked deep inside her boot. She took another, smaller knife and slid it up her sleeve. She left a note on the table, weighed down by the wooden bear he had carved for Ben. "Don't follow. Don't wake the boys. Don't bleed for me. If I can end this, I will. If I can't, get them far away. Get them safe. I love you." She didn't cry. There were no more tears left. Not even when she crossed the frozen creek and saw the familiar shape of the old crossroads emerge from the morning mist. Frank was already there. He was sitting on a fallen log, his rifle resting across his lap, a cruel sneer curling his lip. He looked like he was the king of this cold, dead mountain. "Well, well," he said, his voice dripping with venom. "Look what the snow dragged back." She didn't answer him. She just stood there, her hands at her sides, trying to control the tremor in her fingers. He stood up, stretched languidly, and spat a brown stream of tobacco juice into the pristine white snow. "You know, I could have forgiven you, Evie," he said, taking a slow step toward her, "if you'd come back quiet, on your knees, with them brats of yours lined up like little dogs." "I'm not yours anymore, Frank," she said, her voice low and steady, surprising even herself. Frank's smile vanished, replaced by a cold, flat rage. "You were mine the minute I first broke you. he hissed. "And you stayed mine every time I buried your name in the dirt. You belong to me." Evelyn's hand twitched, moving instinctively toward the knife hidden in her sleeve. Frank saw the movement and let out a short, ugly laugh. But what he didn't see was Samuel stepping silently from the trees behind him. He didn't hear the soft crunch of snow beneath boots that were trained to move like shadows. He didn't see the axe until it was just inches from his face, a blur of motion and glinting steel. The blow didn't land. Not quite. At the last possible second, Frank must have sensed something. He turned, stumbling backward, just as the axe swung past his head. The rifle in his hands went off with a deafening roar, the bullet flying harmlessly into the trees. In that same instant, Evelyn lunged. She didn't remember drawing the knife from her boot. She only remembered the sickening wet sound it made as it sank deep into Frank's thigh. He screamed, a high, piercing sound of shock and pain. Samuel moved like a force of nature, a blur of righteous fury. He grabbed Frank by the collar of his coat and wrenched him backward, throwing him to the ground. The fight was short, brutal, and utterly one-sided. When it ended, Frank lay crumpled in the snow, his face a bloodied mess, his expensive rifle snapped in two over Samuel's knee. He was still breathing, but just barely. Samuel didn't speak. He just knelt beside the pathetic, whimpering man. "Next time," he said, his voice a low, terrifying whisper. "I take your hands." Then he stood, turned his back on Frank, and took Evelyn's hand. Together, they started the long walk home, leaving Frank to bleed in the snow. But the danger wasn't over. As they walked away, Evelyn glanced back up at the high ridge overlooking the crossroads. And for just a moment, she saw them. Two figures, watching from the trees. Frank's men had seen the whole thing, and she knew, with a chilling certainty, they weren't finished yet. Samuel didn't say a word for the entire walk back to the cabin. His silence was heavy, a dense fog of unspoken emotions. Evelyn limped beside him, her boot now soaked through where the snow had melted into her sock, a fresh scrape across her cheek, already starting to freeze in the biting wind. Behind them, Frank Wade had gone quiet, left in the snow like a piece of discarded trash. Samuel had made sure he could still crawl, but just barely. That had been deliberate. Let the man drag his shame and his wounded body back to whatever miserable pit he'd crawled out of. Let him try to explain to his men how one woman and one quiet lumberjack had brought him to his knees. But Samuel also knew something that chilled Evelyn to the bone. Men like Frank rarely came alone, and they never stayed humiliated. He wouldn't nurse his wound and learn from his mistake. He would let it fester. He would plot. And he would return, not with threats, but with fire. Inside the cabin, the boys were still sleeping, blissfully unaware. Evelyn sat down hard on the floor beside the fire, and a great, shuddering breath she hadn't realized she was holding escaped her lips. Her knees gave out completely. Her hands began to shake uncontrollably. Samuel took her coat from her shoulders, his movements slow and gentle, and set it by the hearth to dry. He crouched down in front of her to examine the gash on her face. "Just skin," he murmured, his voice rough but tender. "I'm fine," she whispered, though she was anything but. He stood and brought a clean rag from the basin of water by the door. He dipped it in the warm water and added a dab of a strong-smelling herbal salve from a clay jar on the mantel. He carefully began to clean the cut. She winced, not from the sting of the wound, but from the unexpected tenderness of his touch. "Why did you follow me?" she asked, her voice choked with emotion. He didn't look up from his task. "You knew I would." "He almost shot you, Samuel." "He didn't," was all he said. They didn't speak more than that. The silence between them held everything the words could not. Her gratitude, his frustration, their shared grief for the peace that had been shattered, and something else, something deeper and more profound that neither of them yet dared to name. By the next morning, Evelyn's limp was worse. Her ankle had swollen to twice its normal size. Samuel insisted she stay off her feet, though she refused to rest for long. The adrenaline that had carried her through the confrontation at the crossroads hadn't faded. It had settled deep into her bones, a second skeleton made of pure will, holding her upright. She washed the boys' faces, fed them breakfast, and kept moving, because to stop moving felt like surrender. Then came the smoke. It started as a thin, black thread on the southern ridge, twisting against the pale gray of the early dawn sky. Samuel spotted it first. He was standing by the window, a mug of coffee in his hand, when his body went rigid. He said only one word, but it was filled with a terrible urgency. Fire. He didn't have to explain. In an instant, the cabin exploded into a flurry of desperate activity. Evelyn swept the sleeping boys into blankets, stuffed what little bread they had left into a sack, and grabbed the bundle of spare clothes and the pouch of coins Samuel had tucked away in the pantry weeks earlier. Micah started crying, his small wails filling the cabin, but she held him close, whispering over and over, "It's all right. It's all right. It's all right," even though she didn't believe it herself. Samuel was already outside, saddling their old placid mule and packing supplies onto a small sled. Daniel and Luke were small enough to ride in the back, bundled in furs. Ben, the eldest, could ride with Evelyn. The cave Samuel had prepared wasn't far. They could reach it in an hour if they hurried. But the smoke was growing, thickening, spreading across the sky like a black stain. Halfway down the hidden path, Evelyn dared to look back, and she saw it. Their small cabin, their sanctuary, was silhouetted in angry orange flames. The roof was caving in, collapsing like a giant ribcage giving way. A strangled sob caught in her throat, but she didn't cry. There wasn't time for tears. They reached the cave by mid-morning. Samuel immediately took his rifle and went to stand watch on the ridge overlooking the path, while Evelyn set the boys down on the furs inside and tried to keep them calm. The twins were old enough now to feel the thick, cloying fear in the air. Ben, his face pale and smudged with soot, asked if their home was gone. Evelyn hugged him tight and nodded. "Yes," she said, her voice steady, "but we're not gone, and that's what matters." They stayed hidden in that cold, damp cave for 3 days. Samuel came and went like a ghost, never sleeping for more than an hour at a time. He moved through the woods like smoke, scouting, listening. Each time he returned, he brought grim news. Footprints spotted near the creek, men's voices heard in the dark. A campsite discovered 3 miles out, where 4 men were waiting, watching. He hadn't seen Frank himself. Not once. On the 4th day, Evelyn woke to find Samuel gone. There was no note, no sound, just an empty space beside her on the furs. An hour passed, which turned into 3, then 6. By the time the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of blood and bruises, the fear had clawed its way up from her stomach and into her throat, choking her. She couldn't just wait. She bundled the boys as tightly as she could in the blankets, kissed each of their foreheads, and turned to Ben. "Stay inside," she commanded, her voice firm. She handed him her skinning knife. "If someone comes and it's not me or Samuel, you take the twins and you hide in the deep part of the cave in the back where it's darkest. Do you understand?" Ben, his eyes wide with a seriousness that no 6-year-old should ever have to possess, nodded. Then, Evelyn took her own knife, fastened a sleeping Micah to her chest in a sling, and stepped out into the dying light of the forest. She found the blood first. It was a dark, ugly streak against the pure white snow, beside the old trail near the creek. It was thick and red, and there were drag marks leading away from it. Then she saw the boot prints. Samuel's, she recognized instantly. But there was something wrong with the pattern. They were staggered, uneven, as if he'd been carrying a heavy weight, or as if he'd been badly wounded. She followed the tracks with her heart pounding in her ears, each step heavier than the last. Night crept in around her, turning the familiar trees into menacing, shadowy figures and the wind into mournful whispers. Finally, she found him. He was slumped against the trunk of a massive pine tree, barely conscious, one hand pressed tightly to a deep, bleeding wound on his thigh. "Evelyn," he rasped, his eyes struggling to focus on her. You shouldn't be here." She didn't answer him. She just knelt beside him in the snow, her hands already working, checking the wound, tearing strips from the hem of her own skirt to bind it. "What happened?" "Trap," he muttered, his voice weak. "Thought I could thin them out. Got one of them, but the others, they saw me." "Are they following you?" she asked, her hands working quickly to tie a tight knot. "No," he gasped, "not yet." She hoisted him up, putting his arm over her shoulders. "We're going back to the cave." "I can't walk, Evelyn." "Then I'll drag you," she said, her voice filled with a determination she didn't know she possessed. It took hours. The deep snow fought her with every step. The suffocating darkness closed in around them. Micah whimpered against her chest, cold and hungry. But she pressed forward, inch by painful inch, with Samuel, half-conscious and muttering, leaning his dead weight against her. When they finally reached the mouth of the cave, she collapsed at the entrance, her knees soaked, her arms trembling with exhaustion. Ben emerged from the shadows, his small face grim, the knife still clutched in his hand. "I didn't move, Mama," he said, his voice a tiny whisper. "Just like you said." She wept then, not loud, broken sobs, but the quiet, shuddering tears of a woman who had been pushed past her limit, only to find that the edge was still waiting. Inside the cave, she cleaned Samuel's wound properly, using the last of their clean linen to wrap it. She stoked the fire until the small cave was warm again. The boys huddled close, their small bodies radiating a nervous energy. Samuel slept, but it was a fitful, feverish sleep. Still, they were together. That night, Evelyn sat beside him and prayed. She hadn't prayed in a long time, not since Frank had made a bitter mockery of every hope she'd ever clung to. But she prayed now, not for escape, not for revenge. She just prayed for the strength to keep walking. In the gray light of the morning, a voice echoed through the woods, sharp and cruel. "Evelyn!" She froze, every muscle in her body locking up. It was Frank. "Come on out now, and no one else gets hurt. I know you're in there." He wasn't bluffing. She knew that sound in his voice. Evelyn rose slowly. She picked up the rifle. She turned to Ben. "If I don't come back in 5 minutes," she said, her voice low and urgent, "you take the others and you go. You find the trail we made, and you head north. Don't you stop until you see the big river. Do you hear me, Ben?" Ben's lower lip trembled, but he nodded. Evelyn stepped out of the cave, into the blinding white light of the snow. Frank was waiting for her. He had his rifle slung across his back, and a fresh, bloody bandage wrapped around his thigh from their fight at the crossroads. Pure, unadulterated rage burned behind his eyes. "You really think this is over?" He spat, his lip curling in a sneer. She raised the rifle, the heavy stock resting against her shoulder. He laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "You won't shoot me, Evie. You never had the stomach for it." "I don't need to," she said, her voice surprisingly calm. Because behind him, emerging from the cave like a specter of death, Samuel had risen. He was limping heavily, his face pale from blood loss. But he held his axe in his hand, his eyes focused and lethal. Frank spun around, his eyes wide with shock. And for the last time in his miserable life, he tried to draw his weapon. The rifle in Evelyn's hands fired once. The sound cracked through the morning stillness. Frank fell. Evelyn lowered the barrel, smoke curling from its tip. Samuel stumbled, his strength finally giving out, and Evelyn rushed forward, catching him just before he hit the snow. They stood there together in the sudden, deafening quiet of the forest. No more threats, no more running, no more fire burning behind them. But what lay ahead for them now? In the silence that followed, they couldn't yet know. The snow buried Frank Wade by morning. Evelyn didn't weep for him. She didn't tremble. She had mourned the man he used to be a long, long time ago. What was left of him, the monster he had become, had been buried in her memory far deeper than this cold mountain ever could. Samuel stood beside her as she packed the frozen earth over the shallow, unmarked grave. They said no words. There were no words that would fit the moment. She wiped her dirt-stained hands on her skirt and was the first to turn away. Back in the cave, the boys were hungry and restless. The small space had kept them warm, but their supplies were dangerously low. Evelyn shared the last of their hard bread between the four of them, tore the final strips of smoked meat into smaller pieces for the twins, and warmed a cup of melted snow into a thin, drinkable broth for Micah. Samuel sat beside the small fire, his face pale and beaded with sweat. The gash on his thigh was infected. She knew the signs all too well. The angry red heat radiating from the wound, the swelling, the faint, foul smell that was beginning to rise from it. He gritted his teeth against the pain, but she could see the muscles in his jaw twitching every time he shifted his weight. She cleaned the wound again, boiling the last of their clean linen strips in the pot over the fire. She forced him to drink as much water as she could. She made him eat the small portion of meat she had saved for him. She sat with him through the long hours, sleeping in short, fitful patches by his side. All through the night, he burned with fever. On the third day, the fever broke. His eyes opened, and the hazy, pained glaze was gone. His grip, when he took her hand, was steadier. The first thing he asked for was the boys. "They're fine," she said, her voice filled with a relief so profound it felt like a physical weight lifting from her shoulders. "But we can't stay here, Samuel. We're out of food." He nodded slowly. "There's a cabin," he said, his voice still weak. "North side of this ridge, an old trapper's place. It might still be standing." "Can you walk?" she asked, her heart sinking at the thought of another journey. He didn't answer her with words. He just pushed himself up, his face a mask of grim determination. "We'll make it," he said. They moved that night, under the cold light of a full moon. She carried Micah strapped to her chest and a satchel with their few remaining belongings over one shoulder. Ben, brave and serious, held Daniel's hand, while Samuel, refusing all offers of help, lifted a sleeping Luke onto his back. The trail was thin and jagged, the snow clinging to every branch, making the trees look like skeletal ghosts. Evelyn didn't speak. She focused only on the path ahead. Each step, each breath, the steady crunch of snow beneath their boots, and the whisper of the wind through the pines. They reached the trapper's cabin just as the first gray light of dawn broke over the mountains. It was a sad, dilapidated thing, leaning like a tired old man against the slope of the hill. The roof was half caved in, but the stone chimney looked solid, and the walls, though weathered, were still standing. The door had no lock, but it held firm against the cold. Inside, the cabin was filled with dust and the droppings of rodents. A single chair lay shattered in a corner, and an old cast-iron stove was rusted black. It wasn't much, but it was shelter. Evelyn found an old broom in the corner and began to sweep, clearing away years of neglect. The mattress on the simple bed frame was ruined, but the frame itself was solid. With their own blankets and pelts, it became something like a bed again. The boys were too tired to care about the dust or the cold. Evelyn tucked them into the far corner, away from the drafty door, and they were asleep in minutes. Samuel collapsed onto the floor beside the old stove and slept for 3 days straight. During that time, they didn't move beyond the small yard of the cabin. Evelyn learned to hunt for rabbits, using an old trap she found still functioning behind the cabin, which she repaired with a piece of wire from a broken fence. When Samuel was able to sit up, he began to carve again. It was something to keep his hands busy, to fight off the weakness and the pain. He carved small toys for the boys, a horse for Ben, 2 identical bears for the twins, and a tiny, intricate rattle for Micah. Evelyn would watch him, his large hands so gentle and precise as they shaped the wood, and she felt a quiet calm settle over her that she couldn't quite name. It wasn't just a distraction for him. It was a kind of earned peace. On the fourth night, as the stars began to appear in the clear, cold sky, Evelyn sat beside him on the broken porch steps. "You never asked me," she said softly into the twilight. Samuel looked up from the piece of wood in his hands. "About Frank, or what happened before?" "All of it," she said. He shook his head, his eyes returning to his carving. "Didn't need to." "Don't you want to know?" He paused, turning the small wooden figure over and over in his hand. "You left him," he said, his voice simple and direct. "That's enough." The silence sat with them for a while, comfortable and deep. "He beat me," she said, the words coming out in a soft, pained whisper. "I think you figured that out. But it wasn't just me, it was the boys. It wasn't always with his hand. It was with his words, his rage, his silence. He would go for weeks ignoring them completely, and then he would snap over nothing. A spilled cup of milk could send him into a fury." Samuel said nothing, but she saw the muscles in his jaw clench tightly. "I tried to cover for them when I could," she continued, staring out at the dark shapes of the trees. "I stopped sleeping through the night. I started hiding food for when he would lock the kitchen after one of his rages. He thought I was too stupid to notice when he'd spend our money at the saloon, or when he started chasing after a girl from town who was half my age. I stayed. I stayed until I couldn't anymore." "I planned it for months," she said, her voice growing stronger. "I waited until the first deep snow of winter, when I knew he'd be too drunk or too lazy to chase me far. Then I packed what little I could carry, and I walked. The twins couldn't understand why we were leaving. Ben cried for the first 2 days. Micah was only a few weeks old. I had no destination, just away." "You did more than most ever could," Samuel said, his voice thick with an emotion she couldn't place. "I don't feel brave," she whispered. "You shouldn't have to," he replied. That night, for the first time since she had fled, Evelyn wept into her own hands. Not for Frank, not for what she had lost, but for the simple, profound kindness of the man sitting beside her. And Samuel just let her. He didn't try to comfort her or quiet her. He just sat with her in the darkness, a silent, steady presence, until the tears ran dry. Weeks passed. The old cabin began to feel like a home. Samuel's wound healed slowly, but it healed well. Evelyn's limp faded away. The boys started to laugh again, their voices echoing through the small clearing. And sometimes, when the sun rose behind the pines just right, bathing the world in a soft, golden light, it felt like they had always lived this way. Chopping wood, cooking over the old stove, bathing in buckets of melted snow. Evelyn taught Ben his letters, tracing them in the frost on the window pane. Samuel built a small sled for the twins and would pull them, shrieking with laughter, across the clearing. Peace, it turned out, was not a destination. It was something you built, piece by piece, with your own 2 hands. But peace like this, she knew, never came without a cost. One morning, a knock came at the cabin door. It wasn't the frantic, angry pounding of Frank. It wasn't the hesitant tap of a lost traveler. It was a calm, intentional, solid knock. The knock of authority. Samuel answered it. A stranger stood on their porch, a tall man wrapped in a thick wool coat, with a rifle strapped across his chest and a silver star pinned to his lapel. "Name's Dawson," the man said, his voice polite but firm. "I work for the ranger's office down in Lewis County. We tracked some smoke up this way last week, saw signs of a disturbance." Evelyn stepped forward, her heart starting to beat a little faster. "We've been living here," she said carefully. "Is there a problem, officer?" Dawson's eyes moved past her, to the boys who were peering out from behind her skirts. "A woman and 4 children," he muttered to himself. He looked back at Evelyn, his gaze sharp and assessing. "You're Evelyn Wade, aren't you?" Her blood ran cold. How did he know her name? Samuel stepped in front of her, his body a solid wall between her and the ranger. "Is that a problem?" he asked, his voice low and dangerous. Dawson hesitated, then slowly shook his head. "No, sir. Not with me. It's just, the sheriff down in Lewis has been asking after her. Your husband, Frank Wade, he put out a claim on you months ago, said you'd kidnapped his children, said you were unstable." Samuel stiffened beside her. Evelyn felt the air leave her lungs. "He's dead," she whispered. Dawson raised a skeptical eyebrow. "You sure about that, ma'am?" "I buried him myself," she said, her voice ringing with a cold, hard certainty. The ranger looked from Samuel's hard face to Evelyn's pale, determined one. He thought for a long moment, then seemed to come to a decision. He reached into his coat and pulled out a folded piece of paper. "Your name's clear now," he said, handing it to her. "That claim he filed wasn't legal to begin with. Turns out your husband had a record as long as my arm. A warrant out for his arrest in another county for robbery and assault. The sheriff dropped the whole thing. You're not a wanted woman anymore. I thought you ought to know." Evelyn stared down at the paper. It was an official document. She saw her name and her boys' names, and beside them the words "Claim Dismissed," stamped in bold red ink. "You're free," the ranger said, a hint of kindness in his voice. She almost didn't believe it. After Dawson had left, she sat on the porch steps for a long time, staring out at the trees, the official paper clutched in her hand. Samuel came out and draped a blanket over her shoulders. She didn't speak for what felt like an eternity. Then she said, her voice barely audible, "I don't know what to do now." "You live, Evelyn," he said simply. "I don't even know how." He sat down beside her and took her hand. "Then we learn," he said, "together." Winter finally broke with the first thaw. The creek began to run again and the birds returned, filling the air with their song. Life began to return to the mountain and to their small family. Evelyn taught the boys how to wash their clothes in a large basin. Samuel, with his own 2 hands, built a second bunk bed for the twins. Evelyn began to carve too. Small things at first: spoons, bowls, handles for tools. The simple, repetitive work kept her hands steady and her thoughts clear. One day, as the twins played a loud game of chase outside and Micah slept soundly in his new cradle, Samuel took her hand. It wasn't an urgent gesture, not one filled with expectation. It was just a quiet, gentle touch, and for the first time, she didn't flinch. "I want to marry you, Evelyn," he said, his voice simple and clear. "Not because you need it, and not because the boys need it, but because I do. I love you. I think I've loved you since the night you stepped through my door, shaking and defiant and covered in snow." Her breath caught in her throat. She stared at him, 1,000 words trembling on her tongue, but none of them would come out. I'm not whole," she finally whispered. "Neither am I," he replied without hesitation. "I've got 4 children. I'd take 10 more if they were yours." He interrupted her, his voice quiet but certain. "You're Evelyn. You don't have to prove anything to me. I want you exactly as you are." A soft laugh escaped her lips. It wasn't a laugh of joy, but of pure, unadulterated awe. "I never thought," she said, shaking her head. "I never thought I'd get to choose again." He smiled, a rare, genuine smile that lit up his entire face. "Then choose." She looked into his kind, steady eyes, and for the first time in a very long time, her future didn't look like a dark, terrifying forest. It looked like him. She nodded once. Just once. Yes. There was no crowd to witness their second wedding. There was no preacher in starched linen, no church bells ringing across a valley. There was only the sound of the birds returning to the mountain and the soft, steady breath of Micah sleeping in the sling across Evelyn's chest. The snow had not yet fully melted from the highest peaks, but the morning sun poured golden and warm between the trees, bathing the rough-hewn steps of the cabin where they stood. Samuel had carved 2 new rings, this time from a piece of sturdy oak. They weren't perfect circles. They were solid and real, shaped by calloused, loving hands. Evelyn watched in silence as he slid hers onto her finger. She said nothing, but her eyes never left his, and for Samuel, that was all the answer he would ever need. They made no grand vows. Life had already carved their vows into them. Through nights without warmth, through wounds and loss and the long, hard road up that mountain, they knew what they were promising each other. It wasn't a promise of romance and ease. It was a promise of refuge. It wasn't a fantasy. It was a foundation. They were husband and wife. Again. But this time, it was real. The boys clapped and cheered, not quite understanding the full weight of what had just happened, but sensing its importance. That night, Evelyn leaned into Samuel with her whole weight for the very first time. Not just the weight of her body, but the weight of her fear, her weariness, and her quiet, fragile hope. And he didn't tremble beneath it. He just held her. That spring, Evelyn planted a garden. The patch of land beside the cabin wasn't much, just rocky, stubborn soil. But Samuel cleared the stumps, and using a borrowed plow blade and hours of back-breaking sweat, he tilled the earth. She knelt in the dirt, with Micah strapped to her back and the twins pulling weeds nearby. And for the first time, she felt like she was putting down roots. Her hands were brown to the wrists, her fingernails full of rich, dark earth. She planted potatoes, carrots, cabbage, and onions, seeds she'd traded for with the little money they'd salvaged. Each row she laid felt like a claim, a declaration. It felt like saying, "We will still be here in the fall." Samuel built a pen for 2 goats they acquired from a farmer down the valley, then a small hen house, then a larger shed to store wood for the next winter. The land, as if sensing their determination, began to respond. The trees seemed to stand taller. The air itself felt softer. At night, the deep silence around the cabin was no longer frightening. It was sheltering. It was the kind of hush that falls in a cathedral, not empty, but holy. Then, one evening, Ben found the letter. It was tucked away in the pocket of Evelyn's old coat, the one she hadn't worn since the morning she had fled from Frank. He brought it to her proudly, like it was a great treasure he had unearthed. His hands were smudged with dirt, his face lit with innocent curiosity. "Mama, is this yours?" She stared at it for a long moment before taking it from him. The paper was creased and worn, the ink smudged from damp and time. It was addressed to her, in a jagged, angry script she recognized instantly. She had never seen it before. He must have written it and hidden it, intending for her to find it if she ever dared to come back. She unfolded it slowly, her hands starting to tremble. "Evelyn, if you think you can run forever, you're a bigger fool than I thought. I know where the trees end. I know what you took from me. You think you're safe up there on that mountain, but the snow doesn't last forever. I will find you." Her chest tightened. The boys were watching her, their faces filled with concern. She quickly folded the paper again and tucked it deep into her apron pocket, forcing a smile. That night, she sat by the fire long after the children had gone to sleep. Samuel joined her, as he always did. He didn't ask what was wrong. He just waited. She handed him the letter without a word. He read it, his face growing dark. Then he tossed it into the fire and watched it curl into black ash. "I buried him," she said, her voice thin and reedy. "We saw the blood. He didn't move, Samuel." Samuel didn't look at her. He just stared into the flames. "I believe you," he said. "But we both know Frank Wade never did die easy." She nodded once, then stood and slid the 2 extra bars across the inside of the door. That night, neither of them slept deeply, and Samuel moved his hunting rifle from the wall and propped it against the hearth, closer to his reach. Days passed without incident. The garden grew. Evelyn began stitching together new clothes for the boys from old flour sacks. Samuel carved a beautiful new cradle for Micah, and Evelyn wept when she saw it, because no one, not even her first husband, had ever made something for one of her children with such love and care. But behind it all, the worry remained. It was like a wisp of smoke in a room where you couldn't find the fire. Then came the footprints. Samuel spotted them first, circling behind the newly built shed. They were too big for any of the boys. They weren't from an animal. It was one set of tracks, from a heavy-booted man. He didn't tell Evelyn right away. He just started quietly checking his rifles more often. He walked the perimeter of their land every morning and every evening. He reinforced the hinges on the cabin door, but Evelyn saw them herself a few days later. A single, deep footprint, pressed into the soft soil behind the henhouse. She turned pale. "He's watching us," she whispered to Samuel that night. Samuel shook his head. It could be a drifter, a lost hunter. But they both knew it wasn't. They couldn't take that chance. That week, Samuel began teaching her to shoot the rifle, not just how to point and pull the trigger, but how to aim, how to breathe, how to fire with purpose. He showed her how to check the sights, how to clean the chamber, how to load and reload quickly, even with one hand. She was stiff and nervous at first, the kick of the rifle bruising her shoulder, but gradually she grew steady. Her aim improved. Evelyn didn't want to be a woman who knew how to use a gun, but she had already been a woman who ran. She refused to ever be that woman again. Then, one moonless night, it happened. The goats cried out first, a sound of pure terror. Samuel was out the door before Evelyn had even reached the window. She saw the fire before she smelled the smoke. The shed, their new shed, filled with their winter wood, was ablaze. Angry orange flames were clawing their way toward the roof. The chickens were shrieking inside their coop. The smoke was rising fast and black against the pale, distant stars. Samuel vanished into the darkness with a bucket, running toward the creek. Evelyn ran to the children. She strapped a crying Micah across her chest and herded the other three toward the small root cellar beneath the floorboards. "Stay here," she whispered fiercely. "Do not make a sound, no matter what you hear." She bolted the cellar door behind her and took the rifle from the mantel. Outside, the fire roared, a hungry, living beast. Samuel was throwing water from the creek onto the flames, his breath coming in ragged gasps, his hands already blistering. Evelyn didn't run to help him. She ran to the other side of the cabin and crouched low, scanning the woods, her eyes searching the shadows beyond the ring of firelight. And then she saw him. He was standing across the clearing, a dark silhouette against the inferno. It was Frank. Alive. His coat was tattered and half-burned. His left arm hung at a strange, wrong angle, but his eyes hadn't changed. They were filled with the same cold, dead hatred she had known her whole life. He stood there like a specter risen from the grave, backlit by the fire he had set. She raised the rifle to her shoulder, the cold metal a familiar weight. He didn't flinch. "Put it down, Evie," he called out, his voice a rasping sound. "You're not a killer." She didn't answer. "I came for what's mine," he snarled. "That man of yours. He's taken enough from me. You've taken enough." She shifted her stance, centering his chest in her sights. "You buried me like a dog," he said, taking a step forward into the light. "Didn't even check if I was still breathing. What kind of woman does that?" "The kind you made," she said, and she pulled the trigger. The shot split the night. Frank dropped to one knee, but not in pain. He lunged. She fired again, the recoil jarring her shoulder. This time he screamed, clutching at his leg. Samuel appeared out of the smoky darkness then, tackling Frank and driving him to the ground. They rolled in the mud and ash, a tangle of limbs and fury. Samuel, strong as a bear, struck with all his might. Frank, wounded and desperate, clawed like a cornered animal. Evelyn aimed again but couldn't get a clear shot. Then Frank's hand found the heavy iron poker from the outdoor fire pit. He swung it wildly. It connected with the side of Samuel's head with a sickening crack. Samuel collapsed. Evelyn screamed his name. Frank staggered to his feet, panting, his face smeared with soot and blood. "You could have come back, Evie," he gasped. "You could have begged." She didn't answer. She just stepped forward, her hands tight around the rifle stock. "Move," he said, his eyes wild. She didn't. Move, or I'll—" She shot him again, right in the chest. This time, he stayed down. The black smoke twisted up around them as a profound silence fell over the clearing. Evelyn dropped the rifle and ran to Samuel. He was breathing. Unconscious, but breathing. She grabbed him under the arms and dragged him, her muscles screaming with the effort, back toward the cabin. Her strength had been stolen from her long ago. But what little she had left, she gave to him now. When she got him inside, she barred the door behind them and sank to the floor, her body finally giving out. The boys were safe. Samuel was alive. Frank was finally, truly gone. And outside, the fire he had started slowly burned itself out. By morning, all that was left of their hard work was ash and silence. Evelyn didn't cry. She just sat beside Samuel in the smoky cabin and waited for him to wake up. Samuel woke with a gasp, his eyes wide and unfocused. For a long, terrifying moment, Evelyn thought he wouldn't know her, that the blow to his head had stolen him from her. But then he said her name, his voice a rough whisper, not with panic, not with pain, just with quiet recognition, as if he were waking from a long, bad dream and was simply relieved to find her waiting. She pressed a damp cloth to the side of his face where Frank's poker had struck. He winced, but didn't pull away. A dark, angry bruise was already forming along his jaw, and a line of dried blood was matted in the hair behind his ear. But he was alive. He was still there. He was still hers. The cabin was half smoke and half silence. Outside, the scorched timbers of the shed were still smoldering, and the few stores they had managed to accumulate were nothing but black ash. The chickens were gone, either scattered or perished in the fire. 2 of their goats had survived. They stood trembling behind the ruined boards of their pen. The land Samuel had cleared, the weeks of work they had poured into this place, all of it had been blackened in a single night. But Frank Wade was gone. Evelyn buried him herself this time. For real. She dragged his body out past the pine line, down to a hollow where the ground was soft and far from the cabin. She didn't bother with pretty words or a marker. She just dug until her arms gave out, and she didn't stop until the last shovelful of dirt had swallowed him from sight forever. She didn't pray, not for him. She saved her prayers for Samuel's steady breathing, for Micah's tiny, congested cough, for the twins and Ben, who stared at her with wide, silent eyes and knew better than to ask why Mama's hands were shaking so badly. It was spring by the calendar, but the mornings were still cold. Samuel couldn't stand for 2 days, so she brought food and water to his bedside, helped him sit up, and carefully cleaned his wounds. He never complained. He just watched her with an intensity that made her heart ache. When the pain finally dulled, and he could speak more than a few sentences without his voice shaking, he said, "You ended it, Avi." She didn't answer at first. She just looked at her own hands, still raw from digging his grave. "No," she said finally. "He ended it the day he first raised his hand to a child." The garden was gone, the coop was destroyed, but Samuel was alive, and so they began again. Not because they wanted to, but because they had to. Evelyn took up Samuel's heavy axe and began to chop firewood, her swings clumsy and crooked, but filled with a grim determination. Her shoulders weren't broad enough, her grip was all wrong, but she learned. She fished water from the creek in buckets that were too heavy for her. She nursed Micah on her hip while stirring a pot of thin soup with her other hand, her eyes constantly drifting to the door, just in case Frank had somehow left behind something even worse than himself. Samuel couldn't walk for a week, but on the 8th day, he pushed himself up and limped to the porch, sitting in the weak sunlight. Evelyn brought him a bowl of boiled potatoes and smiled at the way he squinted at the light, as if he hadn't seen it in a year. "I thought you might give up," she said quietly. "I would have," he replied, his voice still rough, "but you're here." That night, the stars came out, bright and clear in the cold mountain air, and for the first time in her life, Evelyn saw them not as a distant, cold ceiling, but as a promise. The cabin felt smaller after the fire, not because of the damage, but because of their closeness. Samuel's injury meant he couldn't wander far, so the boys began to gather around him like spokes on a wheel. Ben asked him 1,000 questions about how trees grew and why rivers ran downhill. The twins invented new games with every stick and stone they could find. Micah learned to crawl. Evelyn found herself smiling more often, not because anything was easier, but because for the first time, it felt like something lasting might actually grow here, something not built on a foundation of fear. Then came the new letter. It arrived folded into the boot of a lone rider who was passing through from down in the valley. The man was headed west and had stopped to trade for food and ask for directions. Evelyn gave him some of our smoked jerky and pointed him toward the nearest pass. Before leaving, he handed her a sealed envelope. "Found this posted at the general store down by Little Creek," he said. "Somebody there said it looked like your name." Evelyn took it, her heart giving a nervous lurch. She opened it slowly. The writing inside was tidy and elegant, the script of an educated man. "Mrs. Wade, it has come to the attention of this office that the parcel of land upon which your dwelling now stands was sold fraudulently by your late husband, Mr. Frank Wade. Per the settlement laws of Lewis County, and in accordance with the judgment of Land Officer Rowan Tilley, we regret to inform you that the deed to said property is invalid. You are hereby ordered to vacate the property within 21 days of receipt of this notice. If an appeal is to be filed, it must be delivered in person to the county land office in the town of Lewis proper before the expiration of that date. Failure to comply will result in your forced removal and the forfeiture of all personal property." She read it twice, her blood turning to ice. Then she handed it to Samuel. His face went blank, a mask of stillness she recognized as profound shock. 21 days. The law was the law. The land had never been Frank's to sell, which meant it had never been hers to keep. After all the fighting, all the running, all the burying, they were going to lose their home. "I'll go," Samuel said immediately, his voice a low growl. "You can't ride that far yet," she argued, her voice frantic. "Your head, I'll make it work." "You can't leave me here alone with the boys," she said, her voice breaking. He paused, the muscle in his jaw working. "Then I won't." They sat in silence as the fire crackled, the shadows growing long across the wooden floor. That night, Evelyn made a choice. They would all go. Samuel needed rest, but he wouldn't get it alone. The children needed her, but not on this cursed ground that was no longer theirs. If she had fought this hard to build a new life, it wasn't going to be on someone else's grave. They would go to Lewis together. They would appeal the ruling. They would plead their case. They would show the lawmen that this land had become theirs through blood and sweat and survival, if not by a piece of paper. The journey would take days, and they had nothing, but there was no other path forward. So they packed. What little they had left went into the old wagon, which Samuel painstakingly rebuilt using salvaged wheels and a plank door. The beautiful cradle he had carved stayed behind. So did the garden tools, the chicken wire, the half-built shed. Evelyn pressed her lips to the doorway of the cabin as she passed through it one last time. Then she climbed up onto the wagon seat with Micah in her arms and the boys nestled beside her. Samuel sat next to her, his body stiff with pain, but his eyes were set forward, on the long road ahead. They rolled down the mountain path slowly, the wheels creaking, the old mule's hooves steady. They reached the valley after 2 days. The air grew warmer with every turn. The dense trees gave way to open grassland, then to dust. On the 4th night, they slept under the stars, wrapped in old canvas and blankets that still smelled faintly of pine smoke. Then, just before dawn on the 5th day, they saw the town of Lewis. It was no city. It was just a single dusty street with a row of stores, a handful of houses, and one squat, official-looking building with a wooden sign out front, County Land Office. They stepped off the wagon as one, a small, weary family. Inside, the office smelled of stale ink and damp paper. A man with a green visor sat behind a tall desk and barely looked up as they entered. "Name?" he grunted. "Evelyn Wade." The man flipped through a stack of papers. "You the one from up on the mountain?" "Yes." "You here to file an appeal?" "Yes." He pointed a long, ink-stained finger toward a hard wooden bench. "Wait there." Time passed with excruciating slowness. The boys fidgeted. Micah whimpered. Samuel shifted his weight, and Evelyn could see him wince with every breath, but neither of them spoke. Finally, a door at the back of the office creaked open, and a tall man stepped out. He was dressed in a suit that had seen better days, and his face was tired and stern. "I'm Officer Tilley," he said, his eyes scanning their small, disheveled group. "Let's talk." They followed him into a small, cramped room lined with shelves of maps and ledgers. He didn't offer them a seat. He just scanned the eviction notice that Evelyn handed him, his brow furrowed in concentration. "Your husband, Frank Wade, purchased this land from a man who never owned it," Tilley said, his voice flat and official. "And he used a name that wasn't his to do it. The transaction was illegal from the start." "I didn't know that," Evelyn said, her voice shaking slightly. "I only knew the land was empty. We made it livable." "I'm sure you did," he said, without a trace of sympathy. "But the law is the law. The land belongs to the county now." Samuel stepped forward, his limp more pronounced in the small space. "Then the law should see the grave we dug on that land," he said, his voice low and powerful. "It should see the fire we fought, and the children we've raised there." Tilley's gaze flickered to Samuel, then looked back to Evelyn. He was silent for a long moment. "There is a precedent," he said slowly, as if weighing his words. "If you can prove continuous habitation and significant improvement of the land for more than 60 days, you may qualify for retention under what's called an adverse claim." "I have no papers," she said, her hopes sinking. "I have no proof, just my hands." He studied her face for a long time, then gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. "You'll need to swear to it, under oath." "I will," she said without hesitation. "And," he added, "you'll need a witness." Samuel raised his hand. "I'll speak for her," he said. Tilley nodded again. "Then you have 3 days. Return here, then, with your case." They left the building and stepped back into the dusty street. Evelyn exhaled for what felt like the first time in hours. It wasn't over, but it wasn't lost yet. They still had a chance. They found lodging in a small room behind the church on the edge of town. An old woman named Mrs. Miller took them in exchange for a jar of Evelyn's honey and a promise that Samuel would mend her laundry line. It wasn't a home, but it was dry and warm. For the next 3 days, Evelyn wrote. She wrote down every memory she could recall from their time on the mountain, planting the first seeds, feeding the goats, the day Micah first rolled over. Samuel gave his own account, in fewer words, but with a quiet weight that was undeniable. On the 3rd morning, they returned to the land office. This time, Officer Tilley didn't speak. He just sat behind his desk and listened. When Evelyn had finished reading her statement, he stood up. "I'll send a deputy up to the property to inspect," he said, his face unreadable. "If he finds things to be as you say they are, the land can be transferred into your name, not Frank's name, yours." Evelyn couldn't speak. She just nodded, her eyes full of tears. They walked outside into a sunlight that finally felt like grace. The deputy arrived 2 days later. He was a young man named Winslow, barely more than 20, with a nervous set to his jaw and a hat that was slightly too big for his head. He rode a mule and carried a clipboard, which he clutched like it might fly away in the wind. But his eyes were kind, and he nodded to Evelyn with an earnest, respectful tilt of his head. Samuel, though still limping badly, insisted on riding back up the mountain with him, to show him everything they had built and everything they had lost. It took them 3 days to make the journey. Evelyn waited in Lewis with the boys, pacing the small yard behind the church and praying without words. because words suddenly felt too small for the enormity of what was at stake. She stitched a patch in Ben's coat. She told the twins stories about trees that could walk and goats that could talk. She rocked Micah against her shoulder as he gnawed on her braid and drooled on her collar. And in the quiet moments when she was alone, she would look toward the distant, hazy mountains and whisper, "Let him see. Please, just let him see what we made." Samuel returned on the fourth morning. He was dusty and tired, but he was standing tall. The deputy, Winslow, dismounted behind him and walked straight into the land office without a word. 10 minutes later, which felt like 10 years, Officer Tilley stepped outside. He walked directly to Evelyn and handed her a single slip of paper. "You've got your land, Mrs. Vaughn," he said, a small, rare smile touching his lips. He had used Samuel's name. "The deed is in your name now, Evelyn Vaughn." She didn't cry. Not then, not in front of the boys, but her knees nearly gave out from under her. Samuel reached for her elbow, his touch gentle and steady. It wasn't a victory like the ones in storybooks. There were no trumpets, no cheering crowds, just the quiet, worn-out relief of people who had survived more than they ever should have had to. They left Lewis that same afternoon. The wagon creaked under them as they started the long journey home. The boys were nestled between blankets and baskets of dried bread that had been gifted to them by the churchwomen. Samuel sat beside her, one hand on the reins, the other resting lightly on her knee. Neither of them spoke much. There was no need. The land ahead was theirs now, truly theirs, not just because of a piece of paper with a stamp on it, but because of everything they had laid into its soil. When they finally reached the cabin, Evelyn climbed down first. The place was still scarred. The shed was nothing more than a memory of soot. The coop was half rebuilt, but the porch stood firm, and the garden. Even after the fire, a few tiny green shoots had started to push their way up through the ash. They were small, stubborn things. She leaned down and pressed her fingers into the dirt. "It remembers," she whispered to herself. "Even after the burning, it remembers how to grow." The months that followed passed not quickly, but with a steadiness that Evelyn had never known. The cabin was mended, first in patches, then with whole new beams. The roof no longer leaked. The hearth was cleaned of soot and ash. Samuel, though he would always carry a slight limp, resumed his work, felling trees at the edge of the clearing to build a true home. Evelyn took over the garden and began teaching Ben how to coax green things from the stubborn ground. They got more goats and more hens. The new coop was sturdier this time, with a foundation of stone around the bottom so no coyote could ever tunnel its way through. The twins named every single chicken, despite Evelyn's warnings not to get too attached. Ben started drawing things in the dirt with a stick, shapes, animals, and once, when he thought no one was looking, a picture of their whole family, all 6 of them standing hand in front of the cabin. Micah began to walk in the middle of that summer, first in wobbly, wide-legged steps across the porch, then in determined marches into mud puddles and flower beds, and anywhere else he wasn't supposed to go. Evelyn watched him one morning as he toddled straight toward Samuel's axe, which had been left leaning against a stump. He stopped just short of it, crouched down to poke at a beetle, then turned and beamed at her, his face a perfect picture of joy. There was no fear in his eyes, only curiosity and wonder. That night, as Evelyn lay awake beside a sleeping Samuel, she thought about the word home. She had never truly known what it meant before. It wasn't a building, it wasn't a place on a map. It was a feeling. It was the feeling of Samuel's steady breathing beside her in the dark. Later that week, as they stood on the porch together, watching the boys chase each other across the field in the golden light of the setting sun, Samuel slipped his arm around her waist. "Did you ever think we'd get this far?" he asked, his voice a low rumble against her ear. "No," she said honestly, leaning her head against his strong shoulder. "But I never stopped walking." He kissed her temple, and together they watched the sun dip below the peaks of the mountains. Mountains that no longer held ghosts for her, only the promise of 1,000 more sunrises, 1,000 more quiet moments, just like this. They had fought the wolves and the fire and the law itself, and they had won. They had built a life from the ashes, and it was theirs. If you were moved by Evelyn's story of survival and strength, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to our channel for more tales of the human spirit refusing to be broken.